The first time David saw her, he thought he was looking at a force of nature rather than a living being. Brin stood in the center of the preparation chamber, her hulking frame gleaming with sweat and streaked with the fresh blood of her last opponent. Even battered and bruised, she radiated an aura of effortless dominance. 7 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with thick cords of muscle under pale, iridescent skin, she was the most feared gladiator in the pits of Ulker 9. And David was now responsible for keeping her weapons in perfect shape. He was nothing to her, just another human slave, one of the thousands forced to serve the Tlak Consortium, the ruling cartel that ran the gladiatorial arenas across the sector. He had been here for 3 years, toiling away in the bowels of this brutal machine, fixing armor, sharpening weapons, maintaining the machines that ensured the endless cycle of bloodshed continued. She hadn't acknowledged him when they first met. Not at first. She sat on a stone slab, stretching her arms with slow, deliberate motions, ignoring the medics who fussed over her wounds. Her black eyes, devoid of pupils, were fixed on the wall, somewhere far away, somewhere he would never see. David cleared his throat, gripping the heavy bracers he had been assigned to repair. The alloy was dented, the damage from her latest battle obvious. He moved toward her cautiously. "Your gauntlets," he said, setting them down beside her. "I reinforced the wrist joints. Should hold better against repeated impacts now." She didn't respond. David hesitated. Most gladiators barely registered their slaves. Some were indifferent. Some were cruel. Others, like Brin, were simply distant. "I also adjusted the grip on your right-hand dagger," he added, keeping his voice even. "It was off by about 2 degrees. You might not have noticed it, but it could have." "Leave," she said, finally looking at him. Her voice was a low growl, the kind that warned of impending violence. David swallowed and stepped back. He knew better than to push. Days passed, then weeks. Brin fought. David worked. She didn't speak to him again, but he noticed the way her weapons lingered in her hands after he repaired them, as if testing the balance. The slight nod she gave when a blade slid perfectly into its sheath. The way she stopped throwing her gauntlets carelessly aside, instead placing them where he could find them. It was a silent truce. But David had seen enough gladiators to know that even the strongest broke, eventually. Late one night, after the roaring crowds had dispersed and the slaves were left to their work, he found her sitting alone in the dimly lit training chamber. She wasn't sharpening her weapons. She wasn't stretching or tending to her wounds. She was just staring at her reflection in a rusted sheet of metal, her expression unreadable. David hesitated before speaking. "You all right?" She scoffed, barely turning her head. "I didn't think humans concerned themselves with gladiators' well-being." "Most don't," David admitted. "But I do." Silence stretched between them. Then she shifted slightly, resting her arms on her knees. "You fix my weapons." "Yes. And yet, you waste words on me." "Yes." She exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "Why?" David shrugged. "Because you're not just a weapon." For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Something raw, but it was gone before he could name it. "You're a fool," she muttered. "Probably." It was a week later that David made a reckless decision. He had always dreamed of escape. Every slave did. But he had spent 3 years watching others try, watching them fail. No one got out, not alive. But David had something others didn't. He had knowledge. He understood the inner workings of the arena better than most. He knew the guard rotations, knew where the electronic locks were weakest, knew that the Tlak security systems, for all their technological advancements, had one fatal flaw, one that he could exploit. But he couldn't do it alone. And so he did something insane. He went to Brin. She listened, her face unreadable, as he laid out his plan. How they could override the holding cells. How they could use the arena's underground tunnels to reach the landing docks. How he had mapped a route that might, just might, get them past the guards. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she laughed, shaking her head. "You expect me to believe that a mere engineer has outsmarted the entire Tlak Consortium?" David didn't flinch. "You don't have to believe me. But tell me this, do you really want to die in this pit?" Something shifted in her eyes, and for the first time, he saw it. A crack in the iron walls around her. A flicker of something long buried. Hope. Brin sat motionless, her black eyes locked onto David's. A long silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then, finally, she exhaled. You are either the bravest human I have met, or the most foolish. David's lips quirked. Maybe both. She studied him a moment longer before standing. The dim light from the overhead fixtures cast sharp shadows over her massive frame, highlighting every scar and muscle that had been honed through years of battle. If you have a way out, human, she said slowly, then I will fight for it. But know this, if you have lied to me, I will break you before the Tlack even get the chance. David nodded. Fair enough. The plan. Over the next few nights, David worked carefully, refining every detail of their escape. Brin had access to areas he didn't: training arenas, fighter quarters, and restricted spaces where gladiators prepared for battle. She smuggled him bits of information: guard routes, security codes whispered between slavers, the exact number of seconds the main blast doors remained open during shift changes. David, in turn, worked from the shadows, rerouting security protocols and sabotaging the maintenance logs to prevent their movements from being tracked. The underground tunnels beneath the arena were their best shot: dark, damp corridors built centuries ago, long forgotten by the Tlack, now serving as an informal graveyard for broken gladiators and discarded machines. If they made it through those tunnels, they would reach the landing docks, where incoming ships from across the galaxy arrived with new slaves and spectators. If they could hijack one. No. When they hijacked one, they would be free. The breaking point. On the night of their escape, the air in the pits was thick with tension. The scent of blood and sweat clung to the rusted walls. Brin had just come from another match, another opponent reduced to a twitching corpse at her feet. The crowd had roared her name, their cheers deafening. They didn't realize she had already decided that tonight would be the last time they ever saw her fight. She met David in the storage bay, where he had already disabled the security sensors. The flickering blue light above the exit door cast eerie shadows across his face. You ready? He asked. She clenched her fists. I was born ready. David pulled out a small, stolen pulse jammer. Once I activate this, we have 3 minutes before security overrides it. That means 3 minutes to get through the tunnel entrance before lockdown. 3 minutes is all I need. He pressed the switch. The lights flickered, once, twice, before plunging into darkness. Alarms screamed to life. Move, David hissed. Brin didn't hesitate. She crashed through the first set of doors like a battering ram, slamming a guard against the wall with bone-breaking force. Another Tlack soldier barely had time to raise his weapon before she twisted his arm at an impossible angle, silencing his shriek with a knee to the throat. David sprinted behind her, keeping low, avoiding stray blasts from panicked guards. His fingers flew across a control panel, forcing another door open just as Brin hurled a third guard into a stack of cargo crates. They reached the entrance to the underground tunnels. David slammed his palm against the access panel. The heavy metal door groaned and slid open, revealing a gaping maw of darkness beyond. Brin turned back to him. Go. They plunged into the abyss. The tunnels of Ulker 9. The tunnels smelled of rust, mold, and death. Brin took the lead, her massive frame barely squeezing through some of the narrower passages. David followed close behind, his pulse hammering. Every step echoed in the oppressive silence. We should be close, David whispered. If we keep going. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the tunnel. Brin froze. David's stomach dropped. Then, from the shadows, something moved. A shape detached itself from the darkness, a hulking, inhuman figure, its body grotesquely twisted, its eyes glowing red in the dim light. One of the failed gladiators. A revenant. The Tlack had a habit of experimenting on their warriors. When one of them was broken beyond repair, they didn't kill them. They twisted them, turned them into something else. Something hungry. Brin shoved David behind her. Run. Run. David ran. Brin turned to face the beast. It lunged. The impact was brutal, like two titans colliding in the dark. David didn't look back. He couldn't. He reached the tunnel's exit, panting, hands shaking as he hacked into the final security panel. The blast doors to the landing docks were right there. Just one final override and a hand gripped his collar and yanked him backward. He barely had time to register the betrayal before he saw the cold, predatory smile of Varys, the arena warden. "I knew you were trouble," Varys sneered, his violet eyes gleaming with amusement. "But an escape attempt? That's bold, even for a little rat like you." David struggled, but Varys' grip was iron. The warden pulled out a blade, pressing it to David's throat. "The Tlack don't take kindly to escapees, engineer." Then, from behind them, a roar. The revenant was dead. Brin stood at the tunnel entrance, panting, her skin streaked with black ichor. Her chest rose and fell in heavy, ragged breaths. She looked at David, then at Varys, and she moved, faster than David had ever seen her move. Varys barely had time to react before she tore into him. His blade clattered to the ground. Blood sprayed across the walls. His screams were brief, and then silence. Brin turned to David, her eyes, black as the void, locked onto his. "Can you open the door?" she asked, breathless. David's heart pounded. He nodded. David's hands trembled as he reached for the access panel. The metallic tang of blood filled the air, mingling with the acrid scent of burned wiring from the broken security locks. He could still hear the wet, gurgling sounds of Varys dying behind him. Brin was motionless beside him, her body coiled with tension, muscles still humming from the fight. Her chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths, but her black eyes never left the door. David exhaled sharply, forcing his focus onto the panel. The Tlack's security systems were sophisticated, but they weren't perfect, especially not after the chaos they had just unleashed. The pulse jammer he had used earlier had fried half the external sensors, leaving the security doors vulnerable to a manual override. If he was fast enough, they could still make it out before the guards re-established control. His fingers flew across the interface. A small screen flickered to life, scrolling through lines of alien script. "Access denied." David's stomach twisted. "Come on," he muttered, working faster. "Don't do this to me." Brin shifted beside him. "How long?" "Seconds. Maybe less if—" A siren wailed through the tunnels. David swore. They were out of time. Brin turned toward the tunnel entrance, her entire body tensing. From the darkness, the sound of boots echoed, dozens of them. The Tlack were coming. David's mind raced. The security system was locked down, but there was a manual override, a last resort failsafe built into the docking bay doors in case of a power failure. But activating it would trigger an emergency lockdown. They would have 1 minute before the failsafe sealed the entire bay shut. It was now or never. David yanked a side panel open, exposing the emergency release mechanism, a simple hydraulic lever buried under layers of reinforced plating. With a grunt, he jammed his fingers into the gap and pulled. The mechanism groaned in protest. Metal screamed as the failsafe engaged. Then, hisses. The docking bay doors slid open. Beyond them, the vast emptiness of space stretched out in an endless sea of stars. The landing platforms loomed just ahead, rows of ships docked and waiting, their engines humming in preparation for departure. Brin grabbed David's wrist. "Move." They sprinted onto the platform. Behind them, the tunnel filled with shouts as the Tlack guards poured through, their weapons raised. Plasma bolts burned through the air, searing the metal just inches from David's head. Brin moved like a storm. She hit the first soldier with a bone-crushing blow, her fists breaking through armor like brittle glass. Another rushed her, only for her to tear his weapon from his hands and snap his neck in one brutal motion. David ducked behind a cargo container, scanning the docking bay. They needed a ship. Fast. His eyes locked onto a sleek Lorvan-class freighter at the far end of the platform. Unmarked. Unsecured. A smuggler's ship. He grabbed Brin's arm. "That one. We can take it." Brin didn't argue. They ran. The Tlack were right behind them. Guards swarmed onto the platform, their weapons firing in rapid bursts. David felt the heat of a plasma bolt graze his shoulder. He staggered, biting back a cry of pain, but Brin caught him before he fell. They reached the freighter's loading ramp just as a figure appeared at the top. A Lorvan pilot, a short, wiry alien with deep-set eyes and a pair of curved horns protruding from his forehead. He took one look at Brin, then at the tlack behind them, and cursed loudly in his native tongue. David didn't hesitate. He drew the stolen sidearm from his belt and fired. The pilot dropped. Brin grabbed his body and hurled it off the ramp. They ran inside. David slammed his palm against the hatch controls. The ramp retracted, the doors slammed shut, and the ship's security locked in place. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. Then, boom. The tlack were already trying to breach the ship. David stumbled into the cockpit, hands shaking as he powered up the controls. Come on, come on, come on. The engines roared to life. Brin stood at the entrance, watching the sealed door as if expecting it to burst open at any second. Get us off this rock. David gritted his teeth. Working on it. The freighter shuddered as its thrusters engaged. A warning light flashed on the console. The docking clamps were still engaged. David swore. He had two options. 1. Manually disengage the clamps, which would take too long, and by then, the tlack would have cut through the doors. 2. Override the engine safety protocols and force a vertical takeoff, which would rip the docking clamps apart but might also destroy half the ship in the process. It wasn't even a choice. David's fingers flew across the control panel, disabling every safety system he could find. The ship groaned in protest as its main thrusters overloaded. Brin braced herself. Whatever you're doing, do it now. David slammed his fist onto the override. The ship lurched violently, its engine screaming as it tore itself free from the clamps. The entire docking bay erupted into chaos, fire, debris, and a blinding explosion of shattered metal as the ship blasted into open space. David was thrown back against his seat. His vision blurred. His ears rang. And then, silence. Just the hum of the ship's systems. Just the quiet, empty void of space. David let out a slow, disbelieving breath. We made it. Brin didn't respond. David turned his head, and his stomach dropped. She was slumped against the cockpit wall, her body covered in blood. David's heart nearly stopped. Brin was slumped against the cockpit wall, her breathing ragged, her massive frame trembling. A deep gash ran along her side, dark blood seeping through the torn fabric of her armor. Brin. He scrambled toward her, hands shaking. Stay with me. Her eyelids flickered, her black eyes struggling to focus. I'm not dead yet, human, she muttered, her voice rough with pain. Yeah? Well, you're trying real hard to change that, David snapped, already yanking open a storage compartment. He had no idea if a smuggler's ship carried a medkit, but if they didn't, his fingers closed around a pressure injector. Yes. He pulled it free, checking the label. It was a basic wound stabilizer. Not enough to heal her, but enough to stop the bleeding. This is going to hurt, he warned. Brin let out a rough chuckle. Pain means I'm still alive. Great. Let's keep it that way. David pressed the injector against the wound and fired. A sharp hiss filled the cabin as the stabilizing agent flooded her system. Brin jerked, her jaw tightening in pain, but she didn't make a sound. Her breathing steadied slightly. David exhaled in relief. He grabbed a roll of synth bandages from the compartment and started wrapping the wound as tightly as he could. You'll need real medical attention soon, he said. This will hold for now, but... I've had worse, Brin murmured, but her voice was softer now. David swallowed the lump in his throat. He had never seen her like this, vulnerable. A part of him had always seen her as something indestructible, an unbreakable force forged in blood and battle. But now, sitting here, covered in wounds, her massive body trembling from the aftershock of combat, she looked human. Not in the literal sense. She was still towering, still alien, still something entirely other. But in this moment, she wasn't just the invincible gladiator of Ulker 9. She was Brin, and he could not let her die. David moved back to the pilot's seat, his hands still shaking as he checked the ship systems. Their escape had been messy. The freighter's hull had taken damage, one of the stabilizers was failing, and half the control panel was blinking with warning lights. But they were alive. For now. He glanced at the navigation screen. Where the hell were they going? Brin, he called over his shoulder. Do you know any safe harbors? Somewhere we can lay low? Brin was silent for a moment. Then, hoarsely, she muttered, Vos Prime. David frowned. That's in neutral space, right? She nodded weakly. It's a lawless station. The Tlack have no jurisdiction there. We can find a medic and a new ship. David hesitated. He had heard stories about Vos Prime, a sprawling space station riddled with criminals, mercenaries, and rogue traders. It was the kind of place where people disappeared forever, but it was better than being captured. All right, he muttered, setting the course. Vos Prime it is. As he activated the ship's FTL drive, a soft ping sounded from the console. David frowned. Incoming transmission? He hesitated, then opened the comms channel. A crackling voice filled the cockpit. David Whitaker, Brin of Hasgary, you are in possession of stolen Tlack property. Surrender now, and we may yet be merciful. David's blood turned to ice. They were being tracked. David slammed the comms panel off. Brin. His voice was sharp now, urgent. They're tracking us. Brin exhaled slowly. They'll never stop, she murmured. David clenched his jaw. He knew she was right. The Tlack never let their slaves go. And now, they weren't just escaped prisoners. They were hunted fugitives. He had seen what the Tlack did to those who tried to run. They didn't just recapture escapees. They made an example of them. Public executions, genetic mutilations, turning people into those things in the tunnels. That wasn't going to happen to them. David moved to the control panel, fingers flying. We need to scramble our signal. If they have a tracking beacon on this ship, we need to find it and fry it. Otherwise, Vos Prime won't be a refuge. It'll be a trap. Brin grunted, forcing herself to sit up. She was still pale, but her strength was returning. Where would they put it? David scanned the ship schematics. If I were them, I'd embed it in the engine core. Hard to reach, impossible to remove without tearing the whole thing apart. Brin wiped the blood from her lips. Then we tear it apart. David let out a breath. I was afraid you'd say that. The freighter's engine room was a mess of exposed wiring and jury-rigged repairs, typical for a smuggler's ship. David didn't have time to be careful. He yanked off an access panel, exposing the inner workings of the power core. The tracking beacon was nestled deep within the ship's energy conduits. A cruel design. If they tried to remove it improperly, it would send a final distress signal, a homing beacon that would call every Tlack hunter within range. They had one chance to disable it without tripping the failsafe. David exhaled sharply. I need you to hold this wire steady. Brin crouched beside him, still weak, but steady enough. Her massive fingers wrapped carefully around the exposed conduit. David pulled a small ion cutter from his belt. He had 3 seconds. One wrong move, and they were dead. 1. He found the failsafe circuit, tracing its connection through the beacon's housing. 2. He calibrated the cutter's intensity, too much power, and it would trigger the alarm. 3. He cut. The beacon fizzled. A sharp snap of energy surged through the ship's wiring. Then nothing. Silence. The tracking signal was dead. David slumped back, his breathing ragged. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and let out a breathless laugh. Holy shit. It worked. Brin's lips curled in the faintest of smirks. You doubt yourself too much, human. David let out a tired chuckle. Yeah, well, it's been a long day. The ship rumbled beneath them as the FTL drive engaged, propelling them toward Vos Prime. David leaned against the engine room wall, exhausted but victorious. Brin sat beside him, her wounds still raw, but her expression lighter. For the first time since they met, they weren't just survivors. They were free. The moment the ship dropped out of FTL, David understood why Vos Prime was called the Den of Wolves. The space station was a floating beast, a patchwork of ships and stations welded together over centuries, sprawling in all directions like a tangled mass of metal and rust. No laws, no order. Just a hub of outlaws, mercenaries, and black market traders who survived by being meaner than the next bastard. The space around it was just as chaotic. Hundreds of vessels, from battered cargo haulers to sleek bounty hunter ships, hovered around the station in loose, predatory orbits. David adjusted their approach vector, keeping their comms silent. They had no friends here, only danger in 1,000 different forms. Behind him, Brin stirred. She had managed to bandage herself up during the flight, but she was still weak. The wound on her side would take time to heal, time they didn't have. She leaned forward, scanning the view ahead. "Docking protocols?" she asked. David snorted. "You're assuming they have protocols." Brin smirked. "Fair point." David guided the ship toward the outer ring of the station, where the docks were in perpetual chaos. Small skirmishes broke out between crews, traders shouted over crackling comms, and every docking bay was a battlefield of greed and desperation. They needed to get in and out fast. David took a deep breath. "All right. First priority, medical supplies. Second priority, a new ship?" Brin arched a brow. "And third priority?" David smirked. "Not getting stabbed in the back." Brin grunted. "I'd put that higher on the list." They landed in Docking Bay 16, paying a dock worker twice the asking price to ignore their ship's registry. The station's air was thick with smoke and engine fumes. Alien voices barked deals in over a dozen languages, while rough-looking mercenaries eyed them as they stepped onto the metal walkways. David led Brin toward the lower sectors, where he knew they could find a black market medic. The Tlack wouldn't risk sending soldiers into Vos Prime, but that didn't mean there weren't bounty hunters sniffing around. They found the medic in a back-alley clinic, Dr. Kezra, a reptilian Vorian with sharp teeth and sharper instincts. Kezra barely looked up from his work as they entered. "If you're here for a cybernetic implant, come back in 3 days. I just finished fixing a guy who tried to graft a plasma cannon to his spine." David sighed. "We need treatment. Fast." Kezra's yellow eyes flicked to Brin, noting her injuries. "Gladiator wounds," he muttered. "Ulker. 9? Brin's expression darkened. "You ask too many questions, Doctor." Kezra chuckled, motioning to the exam table. "Fine, fine. Lay down before you bleed all over my floor." As Brin stretched out, David crossed his arms. "We also need a ship." Kezra let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, you really are running, aren't you?" David ignored him. "Do you know anyone selling?" The doctor grinned, his sharp teeth flashing. "Depends. How much are you willing to pay?" David hesitated. "We're short on credits." Kezra's grin widened. "Then maybe you steal one." David was not in the mood to steal another ship. Not with Tlack hunters still searching for them. Not with Brin barely standing. But when he saw the ship Kezra was talking about, his opinion changed. It wasn't just a ship. It was a beast. A high-grade Akron-class Corsair, built for speed and military-grade combat. It had a cloaking system, pulse cannons, and a warp drive powerful enough to outrun anything the Tlack sent after them. Brin let out a low whistle. "Now that's a real ship?" David nodded. "Who does it belong to?" Kezra grinned. "Some off-world warlord. Left it here while he negotiates a weapons deal." Brin smirked. "So, if we take it, we'll have a whole army hunting us?" Kezra shrugged. "Probably." David exhaled. "Great. Just great. But the alternative? Keeping the smuggler's freighter and waiting for the Tlack to catch up? No. They needed a ship that could fight. And this one? This one was worth dying for." Brin cracked her knuckles. "So, how do we steal it?" David grinned. "Very, very carefully." The plan was simple. Well, simple in theory. The Warlord, a Cordathian arms dealer named Serlak Vesh, had docked his Akron-class Corsair in one of Vos Prime's secure hangars. That meant high-tech security locks, armed guards, and a lot of ways to die horribly if they weren't careful. David's job? Crack the security system. Brin's job? Break anyone who got in their way. They had one night before Vesh returned from his deal. One chance to steal the ship and disappear. Brin grinned as they walked through the dimly lit backstreets of Vos Prime. "You ever stolen a warlord's ship before, human?" David smirked. "First time for everything." Brin chuckled. "Let's hope you don't get us both killed." David sighed. So did he. The security system was a nightmare. Biometric scans, motion sensors, and automated sentry turrets. But David had spent years working for the Tlack, hacking into things he wasn't supposed to. This was just another puzzle. Brin stood watch as he worked, her massive arms crossed. The hangar guards were patrolling in pairs, each armed with disruptor rifles, lethal at close range. David pulled a pulse scrambler from his belt, carefully wiring it into the control panel. If he could fry the biometric locks without triggering the alarms. The console let out a soft beep. David grinned. "We're in." Brin smirked. "Time to move." They slipped into the hangar. The Corsair was even more impressive up close. Sleek, armored, and built for war. Brin let out a low whistle. "I think I'm in love." David ignored her and sprinted toward the main ramp, keying in the stolen override codes. The ramp hissed open. That's when the alarms went off. David's stomach dropped. "Intruders detected. All units respond." Brin cursed. "What did you do, human?" David swore under his breath. "It wasn't me. The system must have had a—" The first guard rounded the corner. Brin didn't hesitate. She launched herself at him, tackling him so hard he crashed through a supply crate. The second guard barely had time to raise his rifle before Brin ripped it from his hands and crushed his throat with one hand. David pulled out his stolen sidearm, firing at another guard who came sprinting toward them. The shot hit center mass, and the guard crumpled. More were coming. "Get the ship online," Brin barked, slamming a fourth guard into a wall. David bolted up the ramp, into the cockpit. He slid into the pilot's seat, hands flying across the controls. Come on. Engines online. Weapons systems armed." Brin sprinted up the ramp just as the hangar doors opened, revealing a dozen more guards, weapons raised. David saw the Warlord's insignia on their armor, and his stomach dropped. Vesh had returned, and he was pissed. Vesh himself stood in the center of the hangar, tall, armored, and furious. The Warlord's cybernetic eye glowed red as he raised a heavy disruptor rifle. "You think you can steal from me?" His voice was a snarl. "I'll carve your bones into—" Brin didn't let him finish. She grabbed the Corsair's plasma turret controls and opened fire. The hangar exploded into chaos. Guards dived for cover as plasma bolts tore through crates and fuel canisters. The floor shook as secondary explosions ripped through the docking bay. Vesh roared, firing back, but Brin was already sprinting toward the cockpit. "David," she yelled, "get us the hell out of here." David didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the throttle forward. The ship lurched violently, engines roaring to life. The hangar doors were still closing. David's pulse hammered. "Hold on." The Corsair shot forward, barely squeezing through the narrowing gap, just as the entire hangar behind them erupted into flame. They were free. Brin let out a sharp laugh, still breathing heavily. "That was fun." David groaned, rubbing his forehead. "Your definition of fun is broken." Brin smirked. "We got the ship, didn't we?" David sighed, checking the scanners. No Tlack ships in sight, yet. But Vesh? Vesh wouldn't let this go. David glanced at Brin. "We just made an enemy." Brin chuckled darkly. "Then we better make sure we never see him again." David exhaled, setting the ship's course. They had a new ride. They were still fugitives. And now? They were being hunted by a warlord. Just another day in the galaxy. David's fingers danced across the control panel, stabilizing the Corsair's trajectory as they cleared Vos Prime's chaotic orbit. The ship was a beauty, fast, agile, and packed with illegal modifications. But one problem remained. Vesh wasn't dead, and a warlord never forgets. Brin leaned back in the co-pilot's seat, still catching her breath. "How long until we're clear of the system?" David checked the scanners. "We can jump to FTL in 30 seconds. Brin exhaled. "Good. I don't want to stick around." Neither did David. He activated the ship's stealth field, cloaking them from long-range sensors. The Corsair had military-grade jammers, which meant they could disappear, if they were fast enough. But Vesh? He wouldn't just send hunters after them. He'd send killers. David clenched his jaw. "We need a plan." The FTL drive whined as it reached full charge. David locked in a random set of coordinates. Somewhere far, somewhere unknown. Anywhere but here. He reached for the throttle, and the ship's alarms blared. "Warning. Remote access detected." David's heart stopped. Brin shot upright. What the hell was that? David checked the system logs. "It's not the ship. Someone's tracking us externally." Brin frowned. "How?" "We disabled the beacon." David's stomach twisted. Think. If the ship was clean, that meant the tracker had to be on them. His blood turned to ice. Brin saw the realization on his face. Son of a bitch, she muttered. David grabbed a medical scanner from the dashboard, running it over both of them. The screen flashed red. There. A tiny implant, buried beneath Brin's skin. David exhaled sharply. They tagged you. Brin's expression darkened. The Tlack must have implanted it while I was still in the arena, she growled. Bastards. David swore. That means Vesh already knows where we are. They had minutes before he sent ships after them. Brin gritted her teeth. Then cut it out. David blinked. What? Brin grabbed the combat knife from her belt and slammed it on the console. I said, cut it out. David stared at her. You're serious. She held his gaze. David groaned, rubbing his temples. God damn it. Fine, but you're gonna owe me for this. Brin didn't flinch as David pressed the blade to her skin. He worked fast, precise, his hands steady despite the insane situation they were in. The tracker was embedded near her left shoulder blade, just beneath the muscle. The moment the blade sliced through, dark blood welled up. Brin grunted but didn't move. David's fingers found the metallic implant and yanked it free. The tracker hit the floor with a metallic clink. David wasted no time. He grabbed his blaster and shot it. The device exploded into scrap. Brin rolled her shoulder. Not bad, human. David scowled. Remind me never to do that again. Brin smirked. You'll do it again if you have to. David sighed. She's probably right. The ship's alarms fell silent. No more tracker. But then, the comms crackled to life. A deep, guttural voice filled the cockpit. You can run, thieves, but you cannot hide. David's stomach dropped. Brin's eyes narrowed. Vesh. He was already here. David checked the long-range scanners. For ships, 2 Raken-class interceptors, 1 gunship, and David's breath caught. Vesh's personal dreadnought. Brin swore under her breath. He's throwing everything at us. David clenched his fists. We can't outrun him. We need to fight. Brin grinned. Now you're speaking my language. David brought the Corsair's weapon systems online. Missile pods armed. Plasma turrets charged. The first enemy ship locked onto them. David gripped the controls. Brin cracked her knuckles. The fight was on. The Corsair's engines roared as David yanked the controls, banking hard to the left. Plasma bolts streaked past, blinding flashes of death barely missing their hull. The enemy interceptors closed in, sleek and predatory, their cannons already spinning up for another barrage. Brin was strapped into the gunner's seat, hands flying across the targeting console. Her voice was calm, deadly. Brace yourself. David had no time to ask why. Brin fired. The Corsair's turret cannons ignited, sending a blistering wave of plasma fire toward the first interceptor. The ship veered too late. The shots tore through its cockpit, rupturing the pressurized cabin in a burst of flame and frozen bodies. David whooped. One down. The second interceptor dived beneath them, coming around for another pass. The gunship was charging weapons, preparing to unleash a spread of torpedoes. But the real threat was Vesh's dreadnought. It loomed in the distance like a steel predator, its massive cannons already locking onto their position. David's stomach clenched. We don't have the firepower to take that thing on. Brin smirked. Then we don't. David's eyes flicked to the navigation grid, following her line of sight, and he saw it. The asteroid belt. A storm of debris, thick and unpredictable. David's grin matched Brin's. You're insane. Brin's voice was thrilled. I know. David throttled forward. The Corsair shot toward the asteroid field. The gunship pursued, but Brin was already aiming. She fired a spread of plasma bolts, detonating a cluster of smaller asteroids directly in its path. The ship tried to bank away. Too slow. A chunk of shattered rock slammed into its engine block, sending it spinning wildly before it exploded in a brilliant fireball. Brin hooped. That's 3. David checked the scanners. The second interceptor was gone, too, crushed by the asteroids. But Vesh's dreadnought? Still coming. The Corsair weaved through the asteroid field, its shields flaring from occasional impacts. The dreadnought couldn't follow, not directly, but its long-range cannons had a clear shot. A deep voice boomed over the comms. Impressive. But you will not escape me, thieves. Vesh's main cannon powered up. David's heart pounded. Brin, if you have any ideas, now's the time. Brin grinned. Oh, I have one. She stood up from the gunner's seat, unstrapped herself, and strode toward the cargo bay. David stared. What the hell are you doing? Brin tapped the side of her wrist. Her voice came through the cockpit speakers. Opening the cargo doors. David blinked. What? The Corsair's rear hatch slid open, exposing the void beyond. The ship shuddered as depressurization alarms flared. And Brin jumped. David's heart stopped. He saw her free-floating, drifting toward a massive asteroid. And then, the magnetic clamps on her boots locked onto its surface. She landed hard, stabilizing herself. David saw it too late. She had a remote detonation charge in her hands. Brin's voice crackled over the comms. Vesh, you son of a bitch. She slammed the charge into the rock. David's eyes widened. Brin. The asteroid exploded. A shockwave rippled through space, sending massive chunks of debris flying directly toward the dreadnought. Vesh's cannons fired too late. A shattered asteroid the size of a gunship tore through the dreadnought's starboard hull. Another slammed into the engine block. The entire ship twisted, breaking apart. David saw Vesh's bridge ignite, a firestorm ripping through the Warlord's command center. The dreadnought was dead. David barely had time to react. He slammed the Corsair into reverse, swinging back toward the debris field. Brin was floating, her body limp. David's breath hitched. No. No, no, no. The ship's automated retrieval system locked onto her suit. David activated the tractor beam. A pulse of energy wrapped around Brin, pulling her into the cargo bay. David abandoned the controls, sprinting back. The bay doors sealed shut. Brin collapsed onto the floor, motionless. David dropped to his knees beside her. Brin, wake up. She didn't move. David's hands shook as he pulled off her helmet, and suddenly, she sucked in a deep breath. David almost collapsed in relief. Brin groaned, blinking up at him. Still alive, human? David let out a breathless laugh. Barely. Brin smirked. Good. She closed her eyes. David just sat there, exhausted, the reality sinking in. Vesh was dead. The Tlack had lost their trail. And for the first time since Ulker 9, they were truly free. The Corsair drifted through open space, the wreckage of Vesh's fleet burning behind them. David sat in the cockpit, staring out at the endless void. Brin walked in, her wounds still bandaged, but her stride as strong as ever. She dropped into the co-pilot's seat. Where to next? David smirked. Anywhere but here. Brin chuckled. Sounds good to me. David reached for the controls. With a roar, the Corsair's engines ignited, and they vanished into the stars.